From New York, this is Democracy Now!
William Barr's views of presidential power are so radically mistaken that he is simply the wrong man at the wrong time to be Attorney General of the United States.
Attorney General William Barr appears before the House Tuesday, grilled on the deployment of federal forces to confront Black Lives Matter protesters, voting rights, and other issues. We'll air highlights and speak to Reverend Raphael Warnock. He's running for Senate in Georgia. He's pastor at Martin Luther King's former church, Ebenezer Baptist, in Atlanta. He was with John Lewis at his death and will preside over his funeral on Thursday.
This country has become too accustomed and comfortable with black people dying. That's what we mean when we say Black Lives Matter.
Plus, we'll speak to civil rights legend Bernard Lafayette, a longtime friend of John Lewis. The two helped start SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and organized the Freedom Rides.
I became a freedom rider because I was involved in the Nashville movement back in 1960, and I was one of the founders of SNCC. And we wanted to continue the work that we were doing because we've been so successful in desegregating the lunch counters.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States recorded more than 1,200 coronavirus deaths on Tuesday, the highest one-day total since May, with one person dying of COVID-19 every 72 seconds. Arkansas, California, Florida, Oregon, Montana all reported one-day record death tolls as a new federal report warned 21 states meet the definition of a red zone, where aggressive steps are needed to slow transmission of the disease. In Texas, a state tally of coronavirus deaths jumped by 12% Tuesday after officials closed a loophole on how they report COVID-19 deaths. The data shows Latinx Texans are disproportionately more likely to die from the disease. For those who survive COVID-19, there's increasing evidence of long-term organ damage. A new study published by the Journal of the American Medical Association found of 100 middle-aged patients who recovered from COVID-19, 78 had structural damage to their hearts. As the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 rapidly approaches 150,000, President Trump declared Tuesday much of the United States is COVID-free. Speaking from the White House press room, Trump lamented polls showing his approval rating is lagging far behind top infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci.
So it sort of is curious. A man works for us, with us very closely, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, also highly thought of. And yet they're highly thought of, but nobody likes me. It can only be my personality, that's all.
President Trump then walked out of his Tuesday press briefing after a CNN reporter asked him about his retweeting of a video featuring Stella Manuel, an evangelical Christian doctor who's urged people not to wear masks and embrace the drug hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19, despite studies showing it offers no benefit and can cause deadly side effects. Manuel has previously suggested alien DNA is used in pharmaceuticals and that gynecological problems are caused by sexual visitations by demons. Meanwhile, Twitter temporarily suspended President Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., Tuesday after he shared a video featuring Emmanuel and other doctors making false claims about the coronavirus. Twitter said the tweet violated its policy on spreading misleading and potentially harmful information related to COVID-19. On Capitol Hill, the House Progressive Caucus is calling on Democrats to reject a Senate Republican coronavirus stimulus bill as a, quote, policy of mass evictions, mass homelessness, mass poverty, and mass hunger. The Republican bill would slash expanded unemployment benefits that provide an additional $600 a week to about 30 million unemployed workers. That expanded benefit expired last weekend. Republicans have proposed replacing it with a much smaller $200 a week benefit. Meanwhile, the Republican bill would add $8 billion to the Pentagon budget, some of it to pay for money Trump diverted from the Pentagon to pay for sections of the U.S.-Mexico border wall. The American Federation of Teachers warned Tuesday its 1.7 million members are prepared to strike in school districts that fail to protect teachers, students, and school staffers from the coronavirus. The AFT says schools should only reopen in regions with coronavirus transmission rates below 1% and COVID-19 positive test rates below 5%, a benchmark that few states have achieved. In Geneva, Switzerland, the World Health Organization warned Tuesday summertime temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere are failing to slow the spread of the coronavirus. WHO spokesperson Margaret Harris warned against complacency, saying the pandemic's continuing to worsen across much of the world.
Summer is a problem. This virus likes all weathers, but what it particularly likes is jumping from one person to another when we come in close contact. So let's not give it that opportunity. So the second wave idea, we are in the first wave. It's going to be one big wave.
Argentina reported a record 120 new COVID-19 deaths Monday, bringing the country's death toll to over 3,100. Argentine authorities are warning of possible shortages of intensive care unit beds and hospitals in and around Buenos Aires. In Guatemala, the government has begun reopening the economy after months of strict coronavirus restrictions, despite a continuing surge in COVID-19 cases and nearly 1,800 deaths. Guatemala's borders will remain closed, but many industries have resumed operations. Public transportation will gradually start running, and shopping centers and restaurants were allowed to reopen this week. Attorney General William Barr appeared before the House Judiciary Committee Tuesday, where he was grilled over his defense of President Trump's policies, including the deployment of federal forces to confront Black Lives Matter protesters. In a contentious exchange, Washington Congressmember Pramila Jayapal noted the discrepancy between Barr's militarized response to Black Lives Matter protesters and armed militia members who displayed white nationalist symbols at protests against public health measures.
When white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns, there is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president.
We'll have more on this hearing with Raphael Warnock, running for Senate in Georgia. On Tuesday, an Army National Guard officer who witnessed a crackdown by federal agents on a protest near the White House June 1st told a House committee he witnessed peaceful protesters being suddenly tear-gassed without warning, calling the deployment an excessive use of force. The crackdown came after Attorney General Barr appeared in the park ahead of President Trump's photo op holding a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church. Meanwhile, Black Lives Matter protests continue across the United States. In Portland, Oregon, protesters arrested by federal agents on even the most minor charges are being ordered by federal judges to sign a pledge not to protest again as a condition of their release from jail. One attorney with the ACLU called the orders, quote, sort of hilariously unconstitutional, unquote. On Tuesday, a White House official said the Trump administration's in talks with Oregon's governor on a plan to draw down federal agents in Portland. Meanwhile, Seattle's mayor said Tuesday federal agents have pulled out of Seattle. Here in New York, plainclothes police officers snatched a protester from the street Tuesday during a protest march and forced her into an unmarked minivan as uniformed officers pepper sprayed onlookers. The arrest drew comparisons to tactics used by federal agents in Portland. 18-year-old Nikki Stone was released Wednesday morning after being charged with 5 counts of damaging police cameras around City Hall. In Minneapolis, police have issued an arrest warrant for a suspect known as Umbrella Man, who was filmed smashing the windows of an auto parts dealership on May 27th, 2 days after the police killing of George Floyd. Investigators say the man is a white supremacist who sought to provoke violence against protesters. A Minneapolis arson investigator wrote in an affidavit, quote, "This was the first fire that set off a string of fires and looting throughout the precinct and the rest of the city." In Richmond, Virginia, members of George Floyd's family gathered Tuesday at the site of the former monument to Confederate leader Jefferson Davis, which was toppled by protesters in June, for the debut of a 3D hologram honoring George Floyd. Organizers are planning to project Floyd's image at 5 other stops along the route of the 1961 civil rights protests known as the Freedom Rides. We'll speak with a Freedom Rider later in the broadcast, Bernard Lafayette, a close friend of John Lewis. A warning to our audience, the following headline contains disturbing video of police violence. A newly formed coalition in Detroit is calling for an independent investigation into the fatal police shooting of an African-American man named Hakeem Littleton on July 10th. Newly released footage appears to show Littleton was shot repeatedly while he was face down on the ground with an officer on top of him. One officer shot him in the head at point-blank range. The video appears to show Littleton had first fired at the officers but was soon tackled. The Coalition for Police Transparency and Accountability has accused Detroit's police chief of mischaracterizing the shooting as an appropriate use of force by initially only releasing footage that backed up the agency's version of what happened. The Trump administration has announced it will reject all new applications for DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. In addition, the administration said it would limit new work permits for existing DACA recipients to just 1 year instead of 2. Advocates say Trump's latest attack on DACA defies June's Supreme Court ruling against the administration's attempt to kill the Obama-era program. The United Nations is setting up temporary housing units for thousands of asylum seekers stuck in Mexico as they wait for their asylum claims to be heard in the U.S. Some of the housing units will be sent to the border cities of Reynosa and Matamoros, where asylum seekers were evacuated Monday as the region was hit by Hurricane Hanna. At least 5 people are missing and feared dead after several refugee camps flooded. In Boston, a group of undocumented families held a protest Tuesday outside the home of Massachusetts House Speaker Bob DeLeo after state lawmakers failed to include an amendment in a racial justice bill that would have granted undocumented people the right to get a driver's license. In Southern California, police working for the Union Pacific Railroad will no longer collaborate with ICE, that's Immigration Customs Enforcement, in detaining people and transferring them to federal custody. In Bolivia, thousands of protesters marched Tuesday in the city of El Alto, demanding the right to elect a new president after the government of right-wing interim leader Janine Áñez said it would postpone elections for the second time this year, citing the pandemic. Unions and indigenous groups accuse Áñez of continuing the coup d'etat that ousted former President Evo Morales last November.
We will not allow this de facto government to embezzle our plurinational state of Bolivia. In this council, we determined we will carry on with the protest until the September 6 elections are ratified.
Following the coup, Bolivia has experienced one of its deadliest and most repressive periods in decades as the government carries out summary executions and arbitrary detentions. This, according to a new report by Harvard's International Human Rights Clinic and the University Network for Human Rights. James Cavallaro, the former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, said, quote, "These abuses mirror the authoritarian behavior of the dictatorships of the 70s in the Americas. This must stop," he said. At least 212 land and environmental defenders were murdered last year. That's the highest number since the group Global Witness began gathering data 8 years ago. Around 40% of those killed were indigenous people. Colombia was the deadliest country with 64 land and environmental defenders killed. Also high on the list, the Philippines, Brazil, Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala. Joe Biden said Tuesday he'll name his vice presidential running mate next week. On Tuesday, many speculated Biden has chosen California Senator Kamala Harris after Biden was photographed holding notes featuring Harris's name, followed by 5 talking points. Do not hold grudges, campaigned with me in Jill, talented, great help to campaign, and great respect for her. 2 transgender women were killed in the U.S. this week. In New York, a 32-year-old trans woman was fatally stabbed in an apartment building in the Bronx over the weekend. Some on social media have identified her as Tiffany Harris, but her name has not been confirmed. The police are reportedly searching for a man captured on surveillance cameras in connection with her killing. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a 24-year-old transgender woman identified as Kuasha D. Hardy was shot to death Monday. She was a hairstylist. Their deaths are believed to be the 20th and 21st killing of transgender and gender nonconforming people in the U.S. this year. And a lawyer for WikiLeaks said Monday the United States is preparing to bring more charges against Julian Assange, who already faces up to 175 years in prison on espionage and hacking charges. Assange is currently facing an extradition trial in London. This is his lawyer, former Spanish judge Baltasar Garzón.
Julian Assange ha sido objeto de una persecución.
Julian Assange has been the subject of political persecution in which all of the rules of due process have been broken. False evidence has been used, illegal evidence has been used, and the procedure in the United States has been totally contaminated as a result.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman, broadcasting from New York. Juan Gonzalez is sheltering in place at his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, Attorney General William Barr faced questions from the House Judiciary Committee Tuesday in a confrontational 5-hour hearing chaired by New York Congressman Jerry Nadler.
William Barr's views of presidential power are so radically mistaken that he is simply the wrong man at the wrong time to be Attorney General of the United States.
The hearing was delayed by about an hour because the chair, Jerry Nadler, was in a car accident, though uninjured. In one of the hearing's most contentious exchanges, Washington Congressmember Pramila Jayapal noted the discrepancy between Barr's deployment of militarized troops in response to Black Lives Matter protesters and armed militia members who displayed white nationalist symbols as they stormed state capitol buildings in protest of public health measures.
On 2 separate occasions, after President Trump tweeted, "Liberate Michigan," to subvert stay-home orders to protect the public health of people in Michigan, protesters swarmed the Michigan Capitol carrying guns, some with swastikas, Confederate flags, and one even with a dark-haired doll with a noose around its neck. Are you aware that these protesters called for the governor to be lynched, shot, and beheaded?
No.
There is a real discrepancy in how you react as the Attorney General, the top cop in this country, when white men with swastikas storm a government building with guns. There is no need for the president to, quote, activate you because they're getting the president's personal agenda done. But when black people and people of color protest police brutality, systemic racism, and the president's very own lack of response to those critical issues, then you forcibly remove them with armed federal officers, pepper bombs, because they are considered terrorists by the president.
That's Washington Congressmember Pramila Jayapal, with coronavirus deaths in the United States nearing 150,000. And the last day, the largest spike in deaths, 1,200 since May. Congressmember Cedric Richmond of Louisiana also questioned Barr's opposition to voting by mail in November's election.
You are aware that African Americans, black people, disproportionately die from COVID-19 coronavirus, correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
And not that it would be the first time that African Americans would risk their lives to vote in this country to preserve its democracy. But the suggestion is that them having the ability to vote by mail would somehow lead to massive voter fraud. But I won't stick to that.
No, I didn't say that. I just state, I think, what is a reality, which is that if you have wholesale mail-in voting, it substantially increases the risk of fraud.
But it doesn't make it likely.
That's all I said.
In fact, the Attorney General has voted by mail himself. As lawmakers questioned Attorney General Barr, the late Congressman John Lewis lay and stayed on the steps of the Capitol for a public viewing. Today, we'll look at the life of John Lewis ahead of his funeral Thursday at Atlanta's historic Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was the spiritual home of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. But first, we discuss this remarkable hearing with the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, who serves as senior pastor at that church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and will officiate over Lewis's funeral on Thursday. Reverend Warnock is also running as a Democrat for Senate in Georgia. Reverend Warnock, it's great to have you back with us. In a moment, we're going to talk with you about your dear friend, Congressmember, civil rights icon, John Lewis. But we want to start on this highly contentious hearing yesterday on the issue of voting rights and what the federal government has done in sending a surge of agents to cities that have major Black Lives Matter protests. Your thoughts?
Good morning, Amy. It's good to be here with you and Juan again. We are witnessing what we have seen over the last 3.5 years under this administration. And that is a kind of hostility towards communities of color that is unabashed and unembarrassed. We are at an inflection point in this country. In spite of the machinations of Donald Trump and those who do his bidding, and including the Attorney General, the good news is that we're seeing a multiracial coalition of people pouring out into American streets, demonstrating by and large nonviolently, and saying that we're concerned about the soul of our democracy. And for William Barr, the top cop in our country, to somehow suggest that vote by mail leads to fraud is wrong on its face. But it's part of what we've seen with the Republicans as we've dealt with this whole issue of voter suppression. They've used the language of voter fraud. Everybody knows that voter fraud through voter ID, for example, is almost non-existent. It's really a way of trying to suppress the vote, but it won't work. We're pushing back here in Georgia, and people are pushing back all across the country.
And Reverend Warnock, I wanted to ask you, in addition, during Attorney General Barr's testimony, he made some remarks in terms of police abuse. And he said, quote, "The threat to Black lives posed by crime on the streets is massively greater than any threat posed by police misconduct." I'm wondering your response to that comment.
Listen, it's a typical red herring that we hear from the likes of William Barr, Rudy Giuliani, and others. The point is that we entrust the police with state power, and they are sworn to protect. And instead of that, people of color very often find themselves on the receiving end of state-sanctioned violence. And so the response to police brutality is that there's crime in communities. There's crime in all communities. And everybody knows that people typically commit crimes against those who are in the closest proximity to them. So this is a typical red herring. It's a distraction, and it won't stand. We have to continue to push back against police brutality. And as we do, we're inspired by those who fought the good fight long before us. We're celebrating the life of John Lewis tomorrow at our church. And I think of the fact that John Lewis on a bridge in Selma withstood police brutality in order to win for us the right to vote. And all of these decades later, even as we celebrate him, we're fighting against police brutality, and we're trying to maintain and strengthen our right to vote. And so we can't turn back now. We have to be vigilant and focused and disciplined. And it's more important now than it's been in a long time. We say all the time that elections have consequences. We're seeing under this administration that elections quite literally can be a matter of life and death. And so folks are standing up, and I'm grateful to be a part of a coalition.
I also wanted to ask you about another aspect of the hearing when Congress members questioned Attorney General Barr on his characterization of Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic as, quote, superb. And especially the New York Congress member Hakeem Jeffries ran down a series of Trump missteps. And, of course, where the president famously said that the number of coronavirus cases would go from 15 to 0.
Superb. You should tell that to the families of now nearly 150,000 Americans who are dead. Superb. We have more than our share of the coronavirus cases. In a real sense, this crisis is being handled in our country as if we were a country with no resources at all.
Reverend Warnock, we want to go to that clip of Hakeem Jeffries questioning Attorney General William Barr.
February, President Trump falsely claimed that the number of coronavirus cases would go from 15 to 0 in a few days. Was that superb? Yes or no?
I'd have to see the context in which it was said.
Here's the context. The number of cases didn't go down to 0. It's over 4 million. Let's go to March. In that month, President Trump said, "I take no responsibility at all for the failure in testing." Was that superb? Yes or no?
It was accurate. The problem with the testing system was a function of President Obama's mishandling of the CDC and his efforts to centralize everything in the CDC when they couldn't.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. That is inaccurate. That's a myth.
It wasn't until this administration. It wasn't
claiming my time. In April, President Trump irresponsibly suggested that the American people inject themselves with bleach. Was that superb? Yes or no?
That's not what I heard.
That's exactly what he said. That's what the American people heard, and you know it, and you can't defend it.
Again, that's New York Congressmember Hakeem Jeffries questioning Attorney General William Barr. And I wanted to add to Juan's question, Reverend Warnock, on Trump's handling of the coronavirus and take it right to Georgia, where you have this amazing confrontation going on right now between the African-American mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Bottoms, versus the governor who refuses, to impose, for example, a mask mandate, though she did in Atlanta. And he is now sued her personally, saying that she should not be able to speak to the press. This African-American woman mayor should not be allowed to speak out.
Yes, this is par for the course with this administration. Listen, this COVID-19 challenge does not know political party. They're playing politics, literally, with people's lives. We have nearly 150,000 Americans dead, 4 million cases, and Georgia is not doing well. And we're seeing in the case of Governor Kemp, as we see with William Barr, folks who are doing the bidding of this president. And what we need is leaders who are elected to serve the people rather than their own interests. And as you point out, the specter of literally robbing an African-American mayor or attempting to rob her of the right of her own voice to speak on behalf of her own constituency is anti-democratic and it's beyond the pale.
We're going to break, then come back to our discussion with you, Reverend Warnock. We want to talk to you specifically about John Lewis. You'll be officiating over his funeral tomorrow in Atlanta. Stay with us. Wintley Phipps performing Amazing Grace Monday in the Capitol Rotunda as the late Georgia Democratic lawmaker John Lewis lay in state, the first African-American lawmaker to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda when President Trump was asked if he would be joining so many others in paying respects to Congressman Lewis. He said, "No, I'm not going." This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we spend the rest of the hour looking at the legacy of the late civil rights icon, 17-term Georgia Congressmember John Lewis, being mourned by the nation as his body makes its way from Alabama to Washington, D.C. to Georgia, with tributes along the way to the man known as the conscience of Congress. On Wednesday, Lewis will lie in state at the Georgia Capitol. On Monday, he became the first black politician to lie in state in the U.S. Capitol's Rotunda, where he was honored by former colleagues, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden. Again, President Trump, notably absent, said he wouldn't be attending. John Lewis's journey home to Georgia has highlighted many hallmarks of his remarkable life, starting in Troy, Alabama, where he grew up on Saturday before moving onto the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Sunday, where red roses were strewn on the spot where Lewis was almost beaten to death by police on that day known as Bloody Sunday as he marched for voting rights. Monday, a motorcade carried Lewis's coffin, stopping at the Martin Luther King Jr. and Lincoln Memorials and the newly established Black Lives Matter Plaza, which Lewis visited before his death, before making its way to the Capitol. This journey ending Thursday with a private funeral at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the spiritual home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Still with us, Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, who's the senior pastor at that church, at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, presiding over Thursday's service. Reverend Warnock, you were with John Lewis in his final days before he died of pancreatic cancer after his family called you to his bedside. Talk about your experiences with him then and going back for years, his significance, what he has taught you.
Several days before John Lewis passed, I received a phone call, and it was evident to the folks who were around him that he was entering the last part of his journey. He was again, if you will, beginning to cross a bridge. And so I made my way to his bedside. I read some scripture, expressed to him my love for him and how much I appreciate and respect what he did for all of us. And even in his weakness, he mustered the strength to say, "I love you too, brother." And it was just deeply moving to be with him and with his family in those moments.
And Reverend Warnock, ironically, the cause for which John Lewis fought for all his life, especially of voting rights, is now Georgia has become a ground zero for the repression of voting rights. Could you talk somewhat about the problems, the enormous problems of long lines and faulty voting machines and poorly trained staff of the recent primary, but also your church is in a lawsuit around voter suppression in Georgia? Could you talk about that as well?
Yes, all of that is correct. The irony of this moment is that even as we celebrate and honor John Lewis, the patron saint of voting rights, he hailed from the state, which in many instances is ground zero for voter suppression. We are still fighting against voter suppression in Georgia, but not only in Georgia, all across this country. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, which is a law in a real sense dipped in the blood of John Lewis and Hosea Williams and so many others who fought the good fight. And even as we celebrate him, it has not been reauthorized. The last time this bill was reauthorized, George W. Bush was president. It passed the United States Senate 96-0. But in recent years, voting has become increasingly a partisan issue. And there are those who are not embarrassed by making it difficult for people to vote. And so John Lewis fought for this to the very last of his strength and breath. The reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act passed the U.S. Congress. I'm running against someone right now for the U.S. Senate who voted against it, Congressman Doug Collins. But it passed the House, made it to Mitch McConnell's desk, and that's where it's sitting, on Mitch McConnell's desk, who stood the other day and offered pious platitudes about the greatness of John Lewis, yet the bill that carries John Lewis's blood is sitting on his desk. If he really wants to honor John Lewis, he ought to pass the bill. He ought to put it up for a vote. That's how we honor John Lewis. There's much conversation about changing the name of the bridge, and we ought to do that. He deserves it. But if we change the name of the bridge, but people are still struggling to exercise their basic American franchise, and we're still in trouble. And so in this moment, in this hour, when we celebrate this great patriot who helped America to live into the fullness of its democracy, let's reauthorize the bill that now bears his name.
I wanted to ask you, Reverend Warnock, about comments of another senator, Republican Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who's proposed a bill that would cut federal funding to any public school that includes the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 project as part of its curriculum. The initiative, named after the year enslaved Africans were first brought to North America. In an interview with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, Senator Cotton refers to slavery as, quote, a necessary evil upon which the Union was built. In response, the Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 project creator Nicole Hannah-Jones tweeted, if chattel slavery, heritable, generational, permanent, race-based slavery, where it was legal to rape, torture, and sell human beings for profit, were a necessary evil, as Tom Cotton says, it's hard to imagine what cannot be justified if it's a means to an end. Your comments on Senator Cotton, if you were to win, he would be your colleague in the Senate, Senator Cotton's statement that slavery was a necessary evil.
Yeah, he's a throwback, and he represents the very kind of thing that we're pushing against in a moment like this. Listen, there will always be voices like Tom Cotton, unfortunately. But I think what's important for us to do in this moment is not to center what he's saying, but to focus on how we strengthen our democracy, to amplify the covenant that we have with one another as an American people. One of the things that inspires me about John Lewis is that he never gave in to bigotry. And he confronted it, but he also never gave in to bitterness. He walked across that bridge knowing that he would imperil his very life by standing up for democracy. He believed in American democracy more than Sheriff Jim Clark, and so he confronted him. And in this moment, those of us who believe in what America is at its highest, who believe in the American ideal of freedom, of one person, one vote, those of us who believe in the dignity of our humanity, and that ought to be reflected in our public policy, which means that people ought to have access to health care, that children, regardless of their zip code, ought to have access to a quality education, and that everybody ought to be able to vote. It's up to us to stand in this moment. And the Tom Cottons of the world, they will be handled. I mean, one of the things you think about in this moment is we're celebrating John Lewis. He confronted bigots. Most of them, nobody remembers their names. Nobody remembers even the names of the clergy, the moderate clergy persons who wrote to Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963 and said that his actions in Birmingham were, quote, untimely and unwise. I guess they thought segregation was a necessary evil. But everybody talks about the letter from a Birmingham jail. Nobody remembers who that letter was written to. You have to go up and research their names. And so I think history redeems the conscience of people like John Lewis who stand up, who represent love and light and liberation. And because of his deeds, he will be kindly remembered by history, and his sacrifice is etched in eternity.
Reverend Warnock, can you just give us the schedule of today and tomorrow as John Lewis's body is brought from Washington, D.C., where it's laying in state, to lay in state in the Capitol in Atlanta, and then the funeral tomorrow?
Yes, the service begins tomorrow at Ebenezer Baptist Church at 11 a.m. It is a private service in terms of attendance. Our sanctuary holds about 2,000 people. Because of social distancing, we'll have about a tenth of the capacity of the church. Because if Black lives matter, then we have to preserve lives at all costs. John Lewis would want us to do the same. But the service will be covered live by the media and live streamed on the Ebenezer website, ebenezeratl.org. So we won't all be in the same room, but we will all be together in spirit as we celebrate this great man, but more importantly, as we press past this moment and reconsider the work to which he dedicated his life. Tomorrow we weep as we should, but the day after tomorrow we stand up and we work for voting rights, for human dignity, for health care, for education for all of our children. That's the work to which John Lewis dedicated his whole life. And if we owe him a debt of service and gratitude, we do that by standing up for the best of us, the best in the human spirit, the best in the American spirit in a moment like this.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock serves as senior pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which is the spiritual home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's running for Democrat, as a Democrat for Senate in Georgia, and he'll be presiding over Thursday's funeral for Congressmember John Lewis. When we come back, civil rights legend Bernard Lafayette, longtime friend of John Lewis, the two helped start SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He'll talk about the Freedom Rides.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free. The truth will make us free. The truth will.
We Shall Overcome by Guy Carawan, the Montgomery Gospel Trio, and the Nashville Quartet from a collection of songs of freedom riders and sit-ins. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we turn to look at civil rights leader John Lewis's early years of activism and his pivotal role in the freedom rides of 1961. John Lewis had been heavily involved with lunch counter sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee, when at the age of 21 he applied and was chosen to be among the 13 original freedom riders who rode buses across the South to challenge segregation laws. In this clip from the PBS documentary Freedom Riders, directed by Stanley Nelson, Congressmember John Lewis reads from his application to participate in the first Freedom Ride.
I wish to apply for acceptance as a participant in course Freedom Ride, 1961. I'm a senior at American Baptist Theological Seminary and hope to graduate in June. I know that an education is important, and I hope to get one. But at this time, human dignity is the most important thing in my life, that justice and freedom might come to the Deep South.
John Lewis was on the first Freedom Ride when it departed Washington, D.C. on May 4th, 1961, with 7 black and 6 white passengers. Lewis was also among the first of the activists to face physical violence when he and 2 other Freedom Riders were severely beaten by white supremacists in Rock Hill, South Carolina. For more on the significance of these rides and John Lewis's legacy as a young civil rights leader, we go to Tuskegee, Alabama, where we're joined by his lifelong friend, co-conspirator, former roommate, Bernard Lafayette, a civil rights leader and scholar who participated in the Nashville-New Orleans Freedom Ride in 1961, a leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which John Lewis headed. Bernard Lafayette, now a professor at Auburn University in Alabama. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Bernard Lafayette, we last spoke to you when Freedom Riders, the documentary by Stanley Nelson, came out at the Sundance Film Festival a few years ago. But take us back, how you first met John Lewis, and take us back to the sit-ins and then the Freedom Rides.
Thank you very much. And I want to, first of all, say that I really appreciate what you're doing in terms of documenting history, because our young people can take advantage of understanding the particulars and how things changed so that they can help to maintain those changes and make even more. So what you are doing is extremely important, and I'm happy to be here to join you. When I was a student at American Baptist College, John Lewis and I were roommates, and we decided that we were going to participate in the workshops that Jim Lawson was conducting there in Nashville, focused on the sit-ins. And it was John who persuaded me to go to the workshops because I had so many jobs on campus, I did not have time for another workshop. But as John has always been, he's very persuasive and he's persistent. So I went to the workshops just to stop hearing John talk. And lo and behold, I was completely consumed by the information and the strategy and that sort of thing. So it was John that really recruited me into it. Now, one thing I want to say is that after the sit-ins in 1960, and by the way, we actually desegregated the lunch counters in Nashville in about 3 months. We were one of the first student groups in our community, in different communities, that did that. One of the things that did that was the fact that we had strategy. We had Diane Nash as our spokesperson because she had to deal with the media and be able to put it in such a way that it was appealing, because we had to try to win as many people over as possible to make changes. You cannot do it without winning the sympathy, if not the active support of the majority. So we got the majority of people in Nashville to really support what we were doing. We had an economic boycott, was about 90% effective. And that was one of the things that showed us we had support from many different people. So
and Bernard Lafayette, when you for the younger people who are watching or listening to this show, could you talk about what exactly were the Freedom Rides? What did you do on a day-to-day basis? And if you could talk about the work that you and John Lewis did to desegregate the Greyhound buses.
Yes. Well, after the sit-ins took place and we were able to desegregate the lunch counters, one of the places that we had the integration was the bus station itself, because we had lunch counters at the bus station, and so therefore we also sat in at those lunch counters. So the Greyhound bus station was completely desegregated before the Freedom Ride started. At Christmas of 1960, John Lewis and I decided we were going to take the Greyhound bus, but we were going to sit on the front seat. The Greyhound bus was still segregated, even though the station was integrated in Nashville. So I sat behind the driver, and John sat behind the the next seat in the front, the bus. Well, we rode all the way from Nashville. We got off at Troy, John did, and I continued. And we desegregated that bus. So when the Freedom Rides were announced by CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, there was no question that we were going to go on the Freedom Rides. And so happened that John was 21 in February of that year, of 1960, and I was not going to be 21 until the July. So we applied. John Lewis got accepted, but I didn't get accepted because I needed parental permission, and my parents wouldn't give permission. My father said, "I'm not going to sign your death warrant." So that was already before the Freedom Ride started, that there was some question about whether or not we would survive. Well, John went on the original ride, and as mentioned, he was beaten up there in the first leg, or the first part of the Freedom Rides. But we decided we were going to continue. And the reason why the Freedom Rides continued is because John Lewis came back to Nashville and said, "Let's go." So we got permission to take over the Freedom Rides. So I didn't need parental permission. So he and I got together, and he took the first group, and I had the backup group, because you have to have a backup group in case if the first group got arrested. The only way you can continue is to have some more people ready to go. And so we had strategy, and we had experience, and we had leadership ability, and we continued that Freedom Ride from Birmingham on into Montgomery. In Montgomery, we were met with violence. And this was after we had traveled from Birmingham to Montgomery with armed guards. The federal, National Guards, and all those people were surrounding us because they had promised to give protection, the governor. But once we got to the bus station, all of the protection disappeared. And we were on the platform. And Jim Swerg was beaten up, and John Lewis was clobbered. And I got kicked in the chest and had 3 broken ribs. So there was nothing you could do with broken ribs. So I went through the entire Freedom Rides with 3 broken ribs. I didn't tell my fellow Freedom Riders because they might have insisted that I not go. So I just kept quiet. I quietly suffered the entire trip.
Can you describe what happened, Bernard Lafayette, in Rock Hill, South Carolina? Congressman Clyburn talks now about regretting that he didn't meet the Freedom Ride bus when it came in, but his wife was pregnant and she wanted him with him. She wanted him with her. But the significance and the violence that you were met with was John Lewis in Rock Hill.
Yes, he was beaten up, and that's one of the first retaliation of the people who were against the Freedom Rides. So they survived that, and they went on, and the bus got burned in Anniston, Alabama. And the others went into Birmingham, and they were beaten and that sort of thing on the buses. So for the early part of the Freedom Rides, the violence had already manifested itself.
And I'm wondering if you could talk also about the John Lewis's leadership role. He became chairman of SNCC and was later succeeded in 1966 by Stokely Carmichael. And of course, there was a major shift in SNCC at the time, Carmichael becoming more frustrated and disillusioned with the white liberal establishment of the Democratic Party after the '64 convention, goes in the direction of Black Power movement and eventually into the Black Panthers. The importance of John Lewis is maintaining his views on nonviolence and why this was such a core of your activism. How did Lewis deal with the changing debates at that time over nonviolence and Black power?
Well, first thing that's important to understand is that it was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was made up of student leaders from various colleges and universities, and they were pulled together by Ella Baker, who worked for Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And these students were there in Raleigh because at Shaw University, because Ella Baker was a graduate of Shaw University. She was an older woman at this time, but nevertheless, this was a school that was very receptive to this national conference, and we formed that. And Marion Barry, who was one of our students from Nashville, was the first chairman of SNCC. He was a graduate student, working on his master's program, and he showed a good deal of leadership in Nashville as well. John Lewis showed leadership because he was the president of his class, and then he was the president of the student body at American Baptist Theological Seminary. So he had that leadership ability all the time. But he didn't promote himself. Others promoted him. It was a student organization, so John was no longer a student. Neither was, Stokely Carmichael, but Stokely wanted to be the chairman because he wanted to take the leadership of SNCC. But SNCC was supposed to be for students. And that's the thing that happened that took it into a different direction, because the students no longer were students in those leadership positions. So the whole idea of Black power. Now, I don't know, we don't have time to do this, but let me give you a hint of what was happening. Stokely and I were cellmates on the Freedom Ride in Jackson, Mississippi, so we stayed up all night arguing with each other about nonviolence. Now, Stokely also felt that Black people should continue to take the leadership of the voter registration movement and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, Blacks who had been subjugated to segregation and oppression for so many years had carved out out of themselves and their experience to be submissive to white folk. I'm breaking it down for you now, okay? When Black students who were part of SNCC went into Mississippi and some places in Alabama and tried to recruit Black people to go down and register, they said, get out of here with that mess. When white students went and told them they were going to come pick them up and they were going to take them to register to vote, they said, what time should I be ready?
Bernard Lafayette, we just have a minute, and I wanted to come back to today. His last public appearance, John Lewis, was at Black Lives Matter Plaza, with the big words Black Lives Matter outside the White House, outside Lafayette Park. You were youth leaders then. You were very active in Selma with John Lewis. What message do you feel John Lewis had, especially for young people organizing today?
Well, that was one of the genius of John Lewis, is that he knew how to relate to people who were different from him and who had different orientations, different values, different philosophies. And that's why he was such a great leader, because he didn't put people down or ignore them or say a lot of negative things about them simply because they didn't agree with him. He found a way to make a way. And he was always looking at the synthesizing our approach rather than dividing.
We are going to have to leave it there, but before we go, I want to wish you a very happy 80th birthday.
Thank you.
Bernard Lafayette, civil rights leader, scholar, longtime friend of the late Congressmember John Lewis, his former roommate. We wish you a very happy birthday. And that does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe, save lives, wear a mask.